Greetings everyone, and welcome to a public domain movie review. Today we will be looking at a film that just recently entered the public domain over here in the US, Cecil B. Demille's original 1923 version of The Ten Commandments. This is an interesting movie to review as there are essentially two movies here. One set in ancient Egypt, and the other set in the 1920s, and as such, I'm going to be reviewing each section separately. The first 50 minutes, essentially the prologue in this 2-hour plus film, is an abridged version of the story of Exodus as told in the Old Testament, starting right before the final plague of Egypt and going up to when Moses destroys the golden calf. I was surprised to find that I really enjoyed this part of the movie, especially since I'm not a huge fan of biblical epics, but the way Demille told the story and was able to condense it into a time frame of less than an hour is to be admired, especially considering that the 1956 remake, by the same director I might add, is over 3.5 hours long. Though to be fair, the section this movie covers makes up a little more than an hour of the later film's runtime, so maybe that isn't a good comparison. The final parts of this section of the movie to look at are the effects, sets, and the scale of it all, easily the most impressive aspect of the film. Demille went all out and made quite an impressive recreation of ancient Egypt, featuring sphinxes and some statues of Egyptian deities such as Anubis, Khepri, and even Apis, and I hope I pronounced those right. This set was so impressive that Demille may have had the set buried under the California sands to keep other filmmakers of the time from using it themselves, as they undoubtedly would have. And can you blame them? A set that was recently unearthed with parts of it still intact with some of the original paint, I might add. That alone speaks to the quality of the craftsmanship when parts of it are still intact after being buried in the sands for 90 plus years. There were some impressive effects as well, such as the parting of the Red Sea and when Moses meets God on the mountain, the latter of which worked around the limitations of silent films and stands strong even today, with the sea effect in particular arguably being more impressive than the one present in the remake, especially if one considers when it was made at the very least. Then there is the scale of it all with just the sheer amount of extras alone. Just look at the scene when the Israelites are crossing the desert. The scale, effects, and storytelling lands this section of the flick an easy 8 out of 10. The second part of the movie, or rather the main attraction, is set in the then modern times of the 1920s and focuses on a pair of brothers named Dan and John, both of whom are in love with a woman named Mary. John, a poor carpenter, follows his mother's teachings of the Ten Commandments while Dan rejects them along with Mary, whom he ends up marrying. Over the course of the film, the two, mainly Dan, end up breaking just about every law of God and man that they can, and he becomes a successful young contractor. When he lands a contract for a cathedral, not only does he build it on bad ground despite warnings not to, he has it built out of shoddy materials to boot. This move comes back to bite him as a wall crumbles and leads to the death of his mother, which haunts him as he is responsible for it. He then attempts to make things right, but in the process he ends up only making them worse. This comes to a head when Dan tries to get some pearls back from his mistress to clear some debts, and ends up shooting her. Now wanted for murder, he tries to escape in a motorboat in bad weather, ends up crashing into an island, and that's the end of him. Mary, meanwhile, ends up at John's place, and after a brief scene where he reads from a different part of the Bible, more or less ends up cleansing her of her sins and brings her into the light. So ends the story of the Ten Commandments. I'll admit, I wasn't sure what to think of the modern section of the movie at first, since it starts out rather slow, but it really picks up after a while, and I found myself enjoying it. The story is a little basic, but it is executed in such a way that it's fun to watch. A solid 7 out of 10, which averages out to 7.5 out of 10 as a whole. Now, the biblical part of the flick, to me, is the more interesting part, so I can see why Demille decided to revisit and expand upon that part as opposed to the modern section, but I actually wouldn't mind seeing a remake of the 1920s part at some point. The story could easily be adapted to take place today, and I think it could work if placed in the right hands. And since this movie is now in the public domain, there isn't much to stop anyone from remaking this section. But until such a time comes, I highly recommend tracking this down and watching at least the first 50 minutes. The sets alone will make it worthwhile. Until next time, everyone.